what's the use of two strong legs if you only run away? And what use is the finest voice when you have nothing good to say? What good is strength and muscle if you only push and shove? And what's the use of two good ears when you can't hear those you love? It's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got. Yeah, it's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got.
Hi, friends. Welcome back to Seeds of Revolution. Today we have another great Camas member that we're talking to, Eligh French. Eligh is a member of the Camas Collective. They're a sociology student, an anti-fascist, and they are passionate about trying to democratize academic knowledge. And I asked Eligh to be on the podcast because they're researching the sociology of the far right, specifically how far-right groups form and how people get involved in the far right to begin with, which I thought was a really interesting topic. So welcome to Seeds of Revolution, Eligh.
Thank you so much for having me, Joel.
I was wondering if you could start just by diving in and telling our listeners how you got involved in this area of research, why you're interested in this, and sort of where your research has been leading you recently.
Okay, yeah. The main thing that got me diving into some rabbit holes that I frankly never really expected to be going down was noticing the normalization of far right or even fascist rhetoric, particularly on social media, as well as the sort of wave of far right politics that we're seeing globally. And I was it started from confusion, really, because I wanted to know how people who, for all intents and purposes, are more or less average people can go from being more or less average people to being Nazis or fascists and engaging in political violence. And so I I took a couple courses that focused on the sociology of the far right and radicalization. And then I've done a lot of research just sort of independently because I've remained really interested in this. And I think it's important to kind of know our enemies as anti-fascists and kind of, as much as it's really disturbing a lot of the time, you have to kind of, I don't know, lift up those gross rocks and see all the little critters and creepy crawlies in these, Telegram channels and Discord servers and understand what's going on there and why people feel like fascism gives them an answer to their problems at the end of the day.
So that's very interesting, especially the idea of researching how people become involved in the far right, because like you said before we started recording, everyone, no matter how fascist and homicidal, they didn't start off that way. So what has your research shown? How do people get involved in these, racist, sexist, homophobic, extraordinarily right-wing groups?
Yeah. So a lot of kind of existing sociological literature on radicalization uh, kind of looks at a couple factors. So individual factors like personality traits, which can make people more susceptible to fascist rhetoric. Some really formative early work by Theodor Adorno and his colleagues um, was work on the authoritarian personality. They developed, among a couple other scales, the F scale, which is supposed to measure people's sort of susceptibility to fascist ideas. And although that work has had, a lot of criticism and methodologically, it's not perfect. it's kind of shaped how we think about certain people as being, um, more rigid in their thinking, more traditionalist, more likely to be conformist, and more likely to see the world as like a scary place. Um, so yeah, these individual factors that of course are related to people's family environments, where they are geographically, their class, things like that. And then you have the environmental factors, um, which, might be you live in a rural area in the southern United States, and there just are accessible far right groups around you, um, who seem to have an answer to your problems, or even articulate some grievances that you have. Um, we find that people who become radicalized often don't go in with certain ideological convictions. And the process really starts with um, certain grievances that they have, and honestly, a search for identity, and some really existential questions that I think we all can relate to, like a feeling of belonging, and feeling like you can make a difference in the world. Um, there's a couple different sort of ideal types of recruitment. I think we kind of think of the classical recruitment to an extremist group as someone who is, they're kind of duped into joining. But a lot of the times, recruitment is more social. So it starts with the development of a social network, um, and then ideological convictions kind of form after. So if someone's searching for social inclusion or meaning, they meet with some people um, who maybe kind of veil their views a little bit. This person feels a sense of belonging, which kind of leads them further down the rabbit hole. Um, and then other people start with some, um, they're looking for like minded individuals. And this is where the internet makes uh, that specific type of radicalization a lot easier. Because back in the olden days, if you were a racist person or anti-Semitic or any other kind of, whatever your prejudice is, it was a lot harder to develop the infrastructure to connect with other people. You'd have to join a physical mailing list, which was a lot more dangerous to you because that means somewhere some white supremacist group has your name and address on their mailing list. And if that's found out, you might lose your job. And so the like upfront cost of participation in these social movements was a lot higher. And so a lot of people, even if you had some like latent sort of, prejudices, or if you had some grievances or felt like, um, you weren't getting yours in society, um, and but weren't able to access easily a group who provided a sort of cohesive frame for these grievances, and a means to change the world to address these grievances, you might not actually ever become a part of any social movement. But now, you can, look up online any number of um, hashtags or uh, chat rooms or websites where people are talking about this. And then all of a sudden, you go from one person who holds these beliefs to someone who's embedded in a social network, and is probably meeting people who have ideologies that sort of take one or two beliefs and kind of form them together. Um, and
There's a traditional, well, I don't know if it's traditional, there's an old assumption on the left, which is
Mhm,
that it's sort of the classical Marxist position that
mhm,
fascists are the unwilling, or I shouldn't say unwilling, fascists are just the dupes of the capitalist class.
mhm.
Fascism
Yeah.
is what happens when capitalism feels like it is in crisis.
Mhm.
The capitalist class will then, through various means, legitimate and illegitimate, dupe certain members of the working class into becoming their shock troops, i.e., black
Yeah.
shirts or brown shirts, whatever it is. And I
Yeah.
know that the scholarship recently has changed when it comes to that perception.
Mhm.
I'm hoping if you could talk a little bit about how fascism and the appeal of these fascist groups really has morphed into, if it ever wasn't, its own sort of social movement and isn't just an extension of capital. It's not
Yeah.
synonymous with capital, but is in fact something that's sort of unique.
Yeah. I think it's not really one or the other. I think you are absolutely right that fascism is sort of a kind of latent structural um, capacity that exists within capitalism. And I mean, we see a lot of really powerful agents of capital, like big oil industries, um, pretty straightforwardly funding um, fascist or at least authoritarian regimes who have their interests in mind. So that is definitely true. But I do think that that sort of classically Marxist, kind of materialist explanation, although it is valid in a lot of ways, it does it doesn't always provide enough answers to understand the more sort of interpersonal, affective motivations that people have for joining a movement that is fascist and reactionary. Um, a lot of people right now, I say people, I mean both activists as well as scholars are noticing that, and this has been true for a long time, but young white men are the most vulnerable to far right radicalization. Um, and this isn't necessarily because, you know, of it's a combination of structural issues, right? So maybe you're angry because the life that you were promised as a man to be the breadwinner of your family, the past that your grandfather and your father were able to have, that's very entrenched in sort of a patriarchal sense of masculinity because of structural issues like deindustrialization, because capital was like, "Oh, actually, labor has a bit too much power now. We're gonna, strip them of power." And through the neoliberal transformations in like the 80s, shift manufacturing down to the global south, and all of a sudden, there's all these people who aren't able to get a good union factory job and provide for their families. And this these structural issues can create sort of individual crises that are tied up in people's masculinities and their sense of relative deprivation is a concept that you hear a lot, which kind of ties in with this idea of aggrieved entitlement. So, relative deprivation is this idea that someone might be relatively well off, middle class, lower middle class in the global north, like that's pretty good. But if you feel like someone, maybe an immigrant family who moved into your neighborhood, are doing better than they should, and of course this is not accurate, or this is gross far right rhetoric. But if you feel like relatively you're being deprived of your sort of like natural place in at the top of social hierarchies, um, you you can feel this
You feel
uh
threatened.
yeah, exactly. And for a lot of white men specifically, that place at the top of the social hierarchy is inherent to their very identities as white men. So this loss of rightful status, this is why it's called aggrieved entitlement. This aggrievement and this sense of entitlement are kind of bound up together. This supposed loss of status isn't just some abstract thing. It's like a violation of their very identities,
Yeah,
which are,
that's interesting. And
yeah.
it doesn't even have to be a loss of status necessarily, because I know
Mhm.
that the work some political scientists have done in the States looking at Trump's victories, the people that he won the most, the largest percentage of vote from, was not the deindustrialized Rust Belt, was not
Mhm.
people who were making less and less money, but was actually people who were well off, who lived in places that have been afflicted by poverty. And while they are well off, they are fearful that they are
Mhm.
to lose their status or lose their material comforts, even if they haven't already. But it's the fear that they might, or like you said, the fear that the immigrant family who moved in next door might somehow take something that's quote unquote theirs, is
Yeah.
what drives their voting behavior. And that's really become Trump's base.
Absolutely. And there is a lot of both the empirical literature that's looking at, like, okay, statistically, who are these voters?
Mm,
And more theoretical literature that, I mean, all the way back to like Umberto Eco talking about it's not the lower class, white folks, it's the middle class
yeah.
who are close enough to capital to feel like, me and the corporations, we're basically, I mean, we're on the same team, right?
Same material
And
interests.
exactly. And I mean, a whole middle class identity is all about differentiating yourselves from the lower classes. And so constantly you're sort of articulating the difference between you and people who are, in a Marxist sense, you are both proletarians maybe, or like, petty bourgeoisie. So yeah, absolutely. I think here I have number 6. One of Eco's points on fascism is the appeal to a frustrated middle class
And I'm
who,
going to stop you, Eli. Could you just, for our listeners who don't know, could you maybe introduce Eco's essay, Fascism? Because I think that is such a
hmm,
benchmark piece of literature in this topic. And if people haven't heard about it, I'd love for you to sort of
yeah.
introduce it to them, and then maybe you can go into some details.
Yeah, totally. I think that's actually a great way I can kind of look through it and connect some of these points to what I've been looking at. But basically, Umberto Eco, he grew up, I think he was a teenager or a young man under Mussolini's regime. He saw the fall of it firsthand. And then he became a thinker, a social critic, a philosopher. And this piece, or fascism, was his attempt to articulate the sort of common tendencies that are inherent in all fascisms, regardless of their particular sort of historical or geographic context. And he has, I think there's 14 points altogether. And I really would recommend the essay. It's a pretty easy read, all things considered, and um, it bears a lot of similarities to what's unfolding to the south of us and also in other places globally. Orban in Hungary is, I think, pretty. He's kind of ahead of Trump's game. They're playing the same game. Um,
And what's
but
interesting about, I think one of the interesting things about Echo's 14 points,
mm,
14 factors, is that, and for me, this really helps clarify my thinking in terms of the modern debate about what is fascism. And Echo
mhm,
makes the point that fascism is not all 14 of these factors. And if
yeah,
you only have 13, then this regime is not fascist. I think
mhm,
I think importantly, what he does, one of the many important things he does in this essay is describe a set of characteristics.
yeah,
And different fascist regimes will have different combinations of some of these characteristics.
yeah,
But for example, just because Donald Trump, doesn't have a death squad yet,
mhm,
so, with the billions poured into ICE, that might
that's
be coming. that
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily mean he's not fascist. There are
Yeah.
several different traditions and factors that go into this analysis. And I thought that was a really important point that he made.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I agree. And in fact, I think people's hesitance to use the F word um
Yeah,
is a
why do you think what is that about, in your opinion?
that's a good question. I think for some people it's a bit of a case of, ignorance is bliss. Because if that term is appropriate, then we have a real problem on
Yeah.
our hands. And that's scary, like it is. That's why I spent time researching this stuff, because it is scary and it's real shit. Um, and I think there are some people who, I mean, maybe even, some liberals or, so-called centrists are it's not like they agree with Trump or with fascism, but they are invested enough in the status quo and see it as either neutral or by default good, that using the term fascism to describe something that is becoming quite normalized, um, it calls into question a lot of pretty baseline assumptions about the rule of law being good by default and the state having the monopoly on violence being good by default. And I think, yeah, I think people have a hard time recognizing that fascism has not suddenly appeared. It wasn't born from thin air in 2016. It has been around, even in America, especially in America, for a long time, wearing a lot of different clothes. And I think some people might feel kind of, yeah, like they've been duped a little bit. Like, um, things like the white power movement and all of these conservative and neoliberal think tanks that have been laying the groundwork for this fascist moment. Um, I mean, we could have been using the F word a long time ago. And yeah, and I think that that calls into question a lot of people's sort of conception of normality. And that's threatening.
On the flip side, and I sort of want to challenge you, play devil's advocate a little bit.
Okay.
Why is it, and if so, why is it important that we identify, say, Donald Trump's regime
Mm,
as a fascist regime? Like, why does it
mhm,
matter? We know what his policies are. We understand that he is horribly anti-Semitic, horribly racist, horribly transphobic, horribly
mm.
anti-immigrant, and that he is implementing policies to hurt all those groups of people. We know
Yeah,
he's a militarist. We know that he is a jingoist and a nativist, and that he is only there to benefit the ultra rich and his friends.
yeah.
Does it matter? There's so much of American discourse, especially in his first term. Now people have sort of accepted it, I think, more. But especially in his first term, so much of the U.S. discourse was, is Donald Trump a fascist? Yes, he is. No,
Mm,
he isn't. Let's fight
yeah,
about it in 2 hours.
yeah.
Devil's advocate, why does it matter? If we know what he's doing is horrible,
Mhm.
we need to fight against it. Is it that important to define him as a fascist as opposed to just, in quotes, an authoritarian or just an oligarch?
Right. I think I think to a certain extent that question, um, it makes us think about what's a good use of our time? Like, is it a good use of your time as an anti-fascist to spend hours and hours and hours reading theory and, trying to create a perfect abstract ideal type that, like, yeah, maybe not. Maybe it's better to be doing other things. However, I think that while we can, and while the term fascism or the term Nazi has a sort of taboo associated with it and a negative, like a social penalty associated with it, I think it is important to deploy these terms to penalize people who are being fascist, um, and delegitimize their speech and their organizing. Um, and I honestly think the window for this is closing. Um, I think that the recent examples of, that lady who called a young child like a racist slur and then got a bunch of money by, given to her on some GoFundMe by racist people, like being exposed as a racist or a white supremacist does not carry the same penalties that it would even a couple years ago.
Do
So I
you,
think,
do you waste your time watching Jubilee on,
oh God,
YouTube?
I unfortunately have gone down the Julie rabbit hole. Yeah.
Did you see the one with Mehdi Hassan?
I No, I don't know if I have. What's
So it's
the
really
gist?
interesting, and I'd love to hear your reaction. Talk about the
Yeah.
normalization of fascism. So Mehdi Hassan does this Jubilee ostensibly with 20 far-right Republicans.
Mhm.
For about 5 minutes, it becomes clear that these aren't far-right Republicans, these are fascists.
Yeah.
And he confronts a couple of them, and one of them, he says, why don't you just call yourself a fascist? You can say, I'm a fascist. And the guy says, yeah, I am. And he laughs and giggles,
Ugh.
knowing that this is going to be on the internet.
Yeah.
These millions of people are going to see this. And the other 20 people in the room are applauding.
Yeah.
And in interviews afterwards, Mehdi's talking about one of the things that shocked him the most was not seeing that there are fascists in the world. He knows
Mm.
that. He's a smart man. But how unabashed and unashamed they were to
Yeah.
publicly embrace fascism on an internet platform in which, 5, 10 million people are going to watch you as you giggle
Yeah.
about how proud you are to be a fascist. It was
It's
just crazy.
yeah. No, it's mind-blowing. It really is. And I do think that this is making me think of a lot of anti-fascist kind of like organizing and activists, a lot of it at least sort of I say historically, but this is kind of like mid 2010s to like 2016, 2017, like pre Charlottesville kind of. Um a lot of these folks, what they would do, and this was effective, would be to like to study the posts that far right groups would make, to go to rallies and take pictures to try and find people without their masks off, and
Docs.
then exactly, and then dox them and be like, "Hey guys, did you know this person in your community is a fucking fascist?" Um, and that is effective to a certain point. Um, so to give some examples, and this is tying into a bigger point, but one of the sort of constellations of groups that I looked at specifically was this network of they're called active clubs. But it originated with this movement, the Rise Above movement or RAM, started by this Nazi Robert Rundo in the States. And these people before RAM sort of kind of it didn't exactly shut down, but its visible online presence uh sort of faded away because a lot of people involved were finally charged federally. And then it sort of dispersed into a active club network that wasn't officially on the surface connected to this RAM group. But originally what they would do was get together, they would train in gyms, and they would train specifically to go to protests and get into physical confrontations with anti-fascists and with other people who were at protests or counter protests. And then they would film these confrontations, literally filming themselves assaulting unarmed civilians, and then put them on social media for other far right Nazi fascist folks to look at and go, oh, haha, isn't that funny? Fascists and Nazis have horrible OPSEC, like really bad operational security. They're posting themselves committing crimes because the police are, I'm not going to say fully on their side, but more or less on their side. I mean, there is a huge, the, like the social networks between, like military veterans, police officers, and people involved in far right militia groups, it's very porous. a lot of recruiting, especially in Canada, happens through the military. Um, and so, yeah, folks, even before this sort of like mass normalization of fascism, were pretty open about committing fascist political violence, because they knew that people in positions of power were more likely to, police some fucking like teenage anti-fascist with an umbrella who, waved it at a police officer threateningly. Um, and so I think the sort of apathy to people outright calling themselves fascist that we see now isn't new, but I think it's especially pronounced. And I think a lot of like 2016 era Gamergate online edgy discourse um was oddly enough kind of instrumental in that, giving people a way to sort of have plausible deniability. But you're spreading, fascist rhetoric. You're spreading white supremacist ideas and imageries, but it's just edgy humor. It's just a joke. Um,
How
and
much how much do you think we on the left how much responsibility do you think we on the left bear for the normalization of fascism? Because I agree with you. I think a lot of it has to do with just changing technologies, like you were
yeah,
saying, social media makes it more acceptable. Trump,
mhm,
Orban, Putin. I mean, the list is endless of
yeah,
authoritarian political leaders who have made far right political movements more acceptable.
hmm
Do we on the left bear any responsibility for the normalization of fascism? Should we have fought harder? Should we have fought differently? Is there something we could have done? And because I think, I hate to break uh, Godwin's first rule of the internet, but, in the 1930s, the infighting between socialists and communists was instrumental in allowing the far right to take power in Germany.
yeah,
Is there some lesson that we on the left have not learned over the last 40 years that
mhm.
should have, that could have helped us maybe not prevent the normalization of fascism, but certainly put some more obstacles in its way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think in general, we should always be fighting harder and doing more. But I mean, I don't know because a lot of the time when anti-fascists and leftists call out this behavior, I mean, and recognize it, call it what it is, um, we are painted by both folks on the far right as well as mainstream media, which is increasingly just the far right, but as, these hysterical SJWs. Oh, how silly. They're just so paranoid. They're called everyone's a Nazi these days. Um, and so even the folks who were doing that, there was this one collective in the Western US of like anti-racist activists who were really instrumental in exposing the Rise Above movement and the Active Club movement. Um, but even folks who were like really on the cutting edge of activism, they are delegitimized by mainstream movement as like, yeah, these paranoid leftists, um, as well as by fascists. And this kind of leads me to one of Echo's points again, which is the tendency that fascists have to make their enemies both too strong and too weak.
Mm.
So the left is both this force that is seeped into every aspect of Western culture. There's this huge global conspiracy, lots of
Antifa's hiding
anti-Semitic
under your bed and
connotations.
it's going to get you,
Ex-
right?
Exactly. The woke mind virus is
Yeah.
everywhere. We're like on the verge of the great replacement. Like, oh, it's horrible. It's apocalyptic, literally. We are, unless something radical happens right now, we are doomed to defeat. And also, we are always going to win because these degenerates are so pathetic and so weak, and victory is assured. All we have to do is keep doing, like, so this sort of victim warrior kind of duality, um it honestly makes it hard for fascists to objectively assess the capacity of their enemies. Um, and
So that might be actually a weakness. I mean, it might be both a strength and a weakness of the fascist movement. On the one
yeah,
hand, it provides them with great propaganda and it's a great recruiting tool. On the other hand, it makes the right structurally incapable of understanding what kind of threat the left presents.
yeah, absolutely. And I think
If the left presents a threat, which these days
yeah.
is
Well,
a questionable proposition.
I think I think I think some far right activists, fascists, Nazis do recognize the threat that um anti-fascists can pose to them. Um, there's this great clip where David Duke is talking to, he's like sort of foundational, like white power resurgence guy, talking
He was an
to,
American politician he got big in the 80s when he ran for governor of Louisiana
yeah,
and
yes, yeah,
almost won. Yeah,
yeah,
as a Klansman.
yeah. And I actually I want to read you this quote, because Nazis are aware that, at least historically, if they are called Nazis, this delegitimizes a lot of them, and a lot of their sort of conservative allies who might agree on a lot of things are uncomfortable associating themselves. And so that saps a lot of strength from their movements because they're not able to form these broad coalitions, which give them a lot of power. So they're quite self-aware about this. And so in this quote between these two neo-Nazis, Duke says, "I'm trying to bring new people in like a drummer, but if they can call you a Nazi and make it stick, it's tough. It's really hard. It's going to hurt the ability of people to open their minds to what you're saying. We have to put the right package together. There are millions of Americans who are alienated and looking for something to believe in." So they know that if you come out, guns blazing, swastika on, like whatever, as much as you might be able to go onto the Jubilee video and announce that, and you might not lose your job. Or if you do, there might be a GoFundMe for you to support you.
That's exactly what happened to the guy on Mehdi Hassan's Jubilee.
Well, gee, look at that.
Yeah.
But yeah, as much as the consequences might not be as harsh as they should be, um, you will sap your movement's strength because that coalition building is really instrumental to the success of fascist movements. I think a fascists' route to power has always involved some form of cooperation, usually with conservative, like business elites whose material interests are shared. Um, but this brings me again to the active clubs, because they've done a really good job at recognizing that there's a bunch of alienated people in America and the world, especially men, who, uh, firstly, this alienation is a consequence of capitalism and the patriarchy. Uh, so they're perhaps not correct in, diagnosing the cause of this alienation, but they are on the money in recognizing that it exists and that it is a potent ground for radicalization. And the thing that I think makes these active clubs dangerous is that on the surface, they seem like just a group of really kind of, macho, hyper, like the kind of people who would be into like alpha male content on TikTok and really into, working out and traditional masculinity, and maybe you're a little too invested in whiteness and have some kind of vaguely nationalistic views, but you're not an out and out Nazi. And these groups can operate more publicly because on the surface, they they are little. If you're a leftist, it'll make your hackles go up right away. You probably know what's going on. But some people could see this and just go, "Oh, it's just boys being boys. Like, what? It's fine. It's fine." Um,
Speaking of the boys being boys, I've been very curious. I've read some commentary on this. I'd love for
mhm.
your opinion. How much of a feeder is the manosphere
Oh,
and Tate
oh God,
into radicalizing these young men?
yeah.
Obviously, radicalizing them to become misogynists, it goes without
Mhm.
saying. But there's been a lot of commentary that you start off listening to Andrew Tate, and after a while, you might, join the Proud Boys. Is that, in your research, in your opinion, has that struck you as accurate? Is that really a valid feeder mechanism for the far right?
Yes, I really do think it is. Because I think that it's sort of the way the algorithm works.
Mm.
Like there is a certain um, algorithmic probability that you are exposed to more and more extreme content. Like on a base level, that is true. Um, and I also think that the individual grievances um, that are articulated by these like manosphere groups, the idea that you are entitled to, you know,
To rule the world.
to rule the world, to have, you know, endless as much female attention. Well, they really buy into a deeply binary essentialist conception of gender. They are ripe with this sense of aggrieved entitlement that like what is rightfully yours has been stolen from you. And this sort of collection of grievances, it doesn't float around loosely. It is these things that are packaged in the sociological term would be a diagnostic frame, um, together to create um, a a whole schema that explains a range of problems. Um, uh, Collective action frames, they simplify the external world. All social movements have them, including leftist ones, and they explain a whole range of problems by selectively emphasizing some situations and de-emphasizing other ones. So you might only have one or two of these grievances that could lead you down far right radicalization. But once you enter the manosphere space, that single grievance becomes connected with a whole host of other ones. And the most important part of this process is that these problems that become articulated as sort of one thing, um, they have to have solutions. And the solutions offered in these spaces are fascist, alt-right, neo-Nazi solutions. Um, I wanna go over a couple, like, really quickly, some social movement theory ideas, and then hop back to talking about the active clubs, because I think it's a really sort of good case study of how some of this works. So all social movements have to have, or at least the successful ones have, clearly articulated diagnostic frames. So these are like what's wrong? What is the social problem here? You have to diagnose specifically what is wrong with the world. Um, and so with, leftist social movements, that could be capitalism, that could be imperialism, all sorts of things. For far right ones, it could be, I mean, God, name it. It could be, queer people being allowed to exist in public. It could be immigration. It could be all sorts of things. But that alone, those diagnosing a social problem alone, that's not going to give you a social movement. You have to have your prognostic frame. So this is the strategy that would resolve the social problems. Suggestions of future actions to be taken that would resolve the grievances that you have. So this could be if you're, far right, or if you're a neo-Nazi in one of these active clubs, maybe that's a race war. And that's how you solve these problems.
Hmm.
But those two frames need the third one, a motivational frame, which gives you the incentive for action. You have to convince someone not only that there's a problem, not only that there's something they can do about it, but that they specifically have the agency to make a difference and to bring about their vision of the future. And in these active club groups, a lot of this motivation comes from this very sort of hyper masculine, like warrior mentality, that is, I mean, in a strange way, you can see the appeal. You go from being some ordinary person who feels like they've kind of been screwed over by whatever big government or whatever specific grievance they have, to being a great warrior who is about to bring about the future utopia ethno state. You have a sense of purpose, you have a sense of identity, and that is appealing. Um, and I think that gets a lot of people. And I think in my I did one sort of thematic analysis of eco-fascist discourse, and I found that it was this motivational framing that was the most prevalent, which is, I think, lends itself to like a lone wolf style, ideologically motivated extremism, because there might not be the fully articulated social movement that someone can join, and feel like that gives them the avenue to resolve these problems. You might have a bunch of propaganda that motivates someone, and they feel like their only option is to take it up themselves.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that is, yeah, I think that's worrying. Um, I think that's been the sort of core process behind a lot of, like neo-Nazi terrorist violence, specifically with groups like the Atomwaffen division. This isn't one well-organized, cohesive group. It's sort of a loose network of cells and individuals who become radicalized and feel motivated to take matters into their own hands. And because fascism fetishizes violence and glorifies violence and absolutely, worships action for action's sake and violence for violence's sake, almost in a kind of spiritual, purifying way, these folks are very likely to, if they feel like they have no other recourse, engage in ideologically motivated violent extremism. And I think that having no other recourse kind of brings us back to what we were first talking about, how a lot of leftists sort of conceive of fascism as this kind of like structural outgrowth of capitalism. I think that the capitalist state, since the 80s, since neoliberalism, but especially, amplified in 2008, has undergone a series of crises that has fundamentally undermined the legitimacy of the capitalist world order. It has gutted the strength of labor, and it has made it abundantly clear for a lot of people that whether you're voting for the Republicans or the Democrats, ultimately it's the corporations who are winning and you're getting screwed over. And you have no means to change this. You know it's wrong, and you are desperate to feel empowered and like you can make a difference. And a lot of groups claim to have answers to that desperation and prey on it.
Well, I'm with you 100%. Why has that been so why has that alienation, well-founded economic
Mhm, mhm,
stress,
mhm,
political disenfranchisement,
mhm.
loss of cultural capital, why has that so successfully funneled into far-right movements and so been so unsuccessfully funneled into left-wing movements? Because
Yeah,
same sort of alienation, that same sort of resentment at the corporate class, we
mm,
can envision an alternate world. We don't, I mean, or we could just look back into history, to
yeah,
Russia in 1905 or 1917, or Europe in 1848, or France in 17. I mean, it's endless.
yeah.
There's such plenty of situations where that exact same type of resentment
Mhm.
towards the wealthy, that exact same type of resentment focused on this incredible and growing disparities of wealth has gone into left-wing movements, not right-wing movements.
Mhm.
Now we're living through the continued complete hollowing out of the left and the strengthening of the right.
Yeah. That is it's a good question. It's an important question. I don't think there's one easy answer. The things that are coming to mind as sort of contributing factors, because I think this is a very, very noisy problem. Um,
Very, very multivariable.
exactly, yes, if to get a little statistical, but, I think the legacy of the Red Scare
Yeah.
is huge. I think, ironically enough, being called a socialist or a communist does still have a certain in certain circles, that negative kind of penalty associated with it, which prevents, like, mainstream politicians from using that because they are worried for their personal interests and their future stakes in the political machine, and worried that attaching themselves to those movements and those labels will, instead of increase their strength and broaden their reach, will do the opposite. So I think that's a
But the more, the regular person though, who's not even contemplating a career in politics, but
oh, yeah.
in years past, in the 30s, in the late 20s and early 30s, during periods of economic dispossession, yes, that's when Mussolini and Hitler's regimes really started to become more powerful. But that's also when the United States saw burgeoning socialism, burgeoning membership in the Communist Party of the United States. And so we
Mhm.
did have these periods in which the common people were not always funneled to the right the way they seem to be now.
Yeah. I honestly think I think a big part of the answer is racism
Yeah.
and sexism and transphobia and all sorts of other things. Like, maybe you this hypothetical person, guy, white guy, straight white guy, classic, easy for radicalization. That's the prime target. You're young. You want to do something about how messed up the world is. And you're like, you know what? I've heard about this anarchist bookstore. I want to go in there and see what it's all about. And you walk in and there's a trans person behind the counter. And you're like, ew, that's gross. Or you walk in and
Versus if you go to the Nazi rally, it's everyone who looks exactly like you.
exactly. Yeah. So I really do think that a lot of these pre-existing prejudices that people have that might not even be articulated into like fully fledged neo-Nazi or white supremacist beliefs, I think that really does make it hard for folks who would benefit even just, materially from the success of a flourishing leftist, socialist, anarchist movement. Um, I think the really deeply embedded prejudice towards the outgroups,
Mm,
whether it's ethnic minorities or these sexual and gender minorities. Um, I think that I think that's a huge roadblock.
yeah,
Um,
that makes a lot of sense.
yeah, I really think it does. There's this piece of research, that found they sort of rejigged the original F scale that Adorno and his people used, and they looked at Trump supporters. Um, and compared them with other groups of voters. And they found that these people who, again, might not be fascists or neo-Nazis. In fact, in their study, they explicitly excluded people who identified with those movements and with those labels. But they found that these folks measured a lot higher on their tendency to divide the world into us and them, a belief in the like general, not even like hardcore ethno-nationalist white supremacy, but like the kind of like vague cultural white supremacy that is sort of embedded in um, culture here a lot. Um, a really deep intolerance of social differences, whatever they might be, um, and a penchant for like cruelty and aggression towards O groups. So not even an intolerance, but like a real cruelty.
Sadism
Um,
almost.
yeah, really. Um, as well as, of course, yeah, seeing the world as a more dangerous place, willingness to submit to a strong leader, yeah, things like that. I think those are big barriers.
We're running up on an hour, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. I really appreciate your research and your really thoughtful commentary. I did have a last question. A lot of the times when we talk about fascism,
Mhm.
especially in 2025, we're thinking about Orban, or for us in Canada, we're thinking about Trump. How much of a threat are these movements to Canadians?
Hmm.
We had the convoy that seems like it's, faded into history. Polyev loses, and we all pat ourselves in the back saying, well, Mark Carney's a reasonable person. At least he's not a fascist.
Yeah.
Are we deluding ourselves into thinking that this is an American problem or a Hungarian problem and not a Canadian problem? Or is it a Canadian problem and we need to do much better in recognizing that?
Yes, I think it is for sure a Canadian problem. I was in Telegram channels of these folks in active clubs who were active on the island, on the mainland, in Vancouver, things like this. So yeah, absolutely, it's here, it's at home. Um,
Not just down south.
Absolutely not. And I do think that the separation, like the willingness even of anarchists to buy into a kind of nationalist cordoning off of politics is really to our detriment,
Yeah.
because that is its own sort of us and them thinking. And I think recognizing that not only are these movements uh oddly enough, nationalists are very international in their there was this one post in this active club Telegram channel that was this huge link to other channels for other countries and areas. So they are explicitly international in their organizing and communication while also being nationalists. So, fascism doesn't have to be logically coherent. But I do think that it is to our detriment when we sort of say, well, we have our own issues here, but at least we're not, at least it's not happening down there, because capital does not recognize national borders the same way we do. Like, the same people in big oil who are funding Trump are going to find a way to peddle their influence within Canadian politics and elsewhere. Corporations are transnational, nationalists are transnational. And so, yeah, not recognizing that and not leaning into transnational, international, and cooperation and networking with other leftists, I think I think we need to stop thinking like that, and yeah, lean into solidarity in whatever form we can have it. Like, really.
I think that's a great note to end on. Eligh, my friend, thank you so much.
Thank you, Joel. This was great.
Yeah, I really appreciate your time and your scholarship, and we'll have to have you back on Seeds because I have a feeling this is not a topic that's going to go away anytime soon. I got a feeling it's going to be
Unfortunately
relevant
not.
for a while.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think you're very right. So I'll see you around then. Take care.
If
Sounds
Jesus
good.
Christ
Thanks,
came
Eli.
back today like you threatened he will, which poor group of people do you think that he would kill? And who would Jesus choose to starve if you gave him the chance? And if there was a genocide, would he take a neutral stance? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would he say it's complicated and there's sinners on both sides? Or would he say that some people, they just deserve to die? If Jesus Christ rose from the dead and on a sidewalk slept, would you extend your hand to him or just watch where you stepped? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus hate the gay folk, the queer folk, or the trans? Would he suggest they end their lives according to God's plans? Would Jesus tell a homeless man to get a fucking job, or turn his back on the poor? Would Jesus be a snob? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus build a border wall? Would Jesus drive a tank? Would Jesus be a landlord? Would Jesus run a bank? Would Jesus Christ feel safe in his skin if he came to your town? And would you still believe in him if you found out he was brown? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Yeah, who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well,